Paul Laurence Dunbar was one of those characters in history which goes against everything that we know. He was the only black person in his class and became a huge success in poetry. He wrote the first lyrics to a play that would be performed in Broadway. Not only that, in his classroom, he was friends with one of the Wright brothers. And this you can see evidently when he writes a poem about flying. Now, he didn't just become a friend of the Wright brothers and go away. He actually, at one point, financed them when they worked for him because he was a businessman on top of that. So he became a friend and a business partner. This is a poem he wrote. Not they who soar, but they who plod their rugged way unhelped by God, are heroes they who higher fare, and flying fan the upper air, misoil the toil that hugs the sod. 'Tis they whose backs have felt the rod, whose feet have pressed the path unshod, may smile upon defeated care, not they who soar. High up there are no thorns to prod, nor boulders lurking 'neath the clod, to turn the keenness of the share, for flight is ever free and rare. But heroes they the soil who've trod, not they who soar. It's difficult to say that the Wright brothers are not the biggest turning point in American history, where everyone around the world sort of looked back and said, why in America was this invented? Why in America did this happen? Why in America and not anywhere else? Now, of course, the dreams of flight had gone back hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years. The depictions made by ancients usually show animals like birds, flying squirrels, even dragoons in some case, which can fly over the world. And because of this reason, there is something divine about flying, the ability to be able to see the world from a top view above everybody else, having wings, of course, and flying over the whole world, being free, unbounded. Now, we can look all over the world if we want to find depictions of people with bird wings in ancient rock art. And of course, it's easy to make the combination or the correlation that a man with wings was probably a god when they depicted it in ancient history. Now, this is easy to talk about when we talk about ancient Egypt, or we're talking about, the Christian religion, or we talk about the Judea religion, or anything like that. But it becomes very difficult when we're talking about Khoisan drawings because they were so isolated from anywhere else. Yet we see the same thing, men depicted with wings. This shows that human beings have always thought about the ability to fly. This one is particularly interesting because you can see here a mother with a baby on her back, and she's got what appears to be wings, has been interpreted that way by historians. And the sweet thing about it is the fact that it's probably like the wishes of a parent to get faster to some location, perhaps even home. Here's another one, which it becomes clearer in when it's computer emphasized. There you go. See, it's it's interesting because what the Wright brothers had done was basically take everything that human beings thought was impossible and just did it. But were they the first? Now, make sure that the ancient alien people never see this image because they're definitely going to say it's a spaceship. When we see the length of the wings and everything like that, sometimes it's tempting to say, how did they put this together? Because some of these wings have nothing to do with the real wings. And of course, it's tempting to think that either they would have put them on ritualistically, so some made of, maybe wood and feathers plucked together, and they would just run around pretending they could fly, or it was just pure art. The design of airships goes back to the 1600s, and airships were one of the first things that people designed in order to solve the problem of flight, and they did solve it. They didn't need something that is attached to the ground like had been previously done as far back as ancient China, and whenever the Wright brothers were stuck, they would go back in history and go and check gliders and airships for help. They did at one point consider using airships, but remember, the problem with airships is that they used a ridiculous amount of energy in the form of chemicals. And so, this idea, though it was a push into the future, letting people know that stuff like this was going to happen, it was not to be, the idea that will drive forever. And of course, combining these airships with gliders that were made by several scholars, started by Ibn Firnas, who we'll get to, it becomes very obvious how the Wright brothers did what they did. But again, what the Wright brothers did was unique in their own way, because of course that's how invention works. Remember, I made a video about invention, and some people were like, no, you have to invent the whole thing, not pieces of it that make it look different. One of the most impressive designs of a early airplane was the Ezekiel Flyer. Now, you're probably thinking the name Ezekiel comes from the Bible. Is it related? And the answer is absolutely. The design and the way that it was made was based off of the later famous verse that is used in Ancient Aliens, but this was the 1800s. And this glider was made with the description: four wheels inside, four wheels and wings and all of that stuff. That verse in the Bible made this person design this structure. And it is said that it did fly at some point, but it's very difficult to know whether it did or not. And then I saw four wheels besides the cherubim, one besides each cherub. The wheels radiating were sparkling like diamonds in the sun. All four wheels looked alike, each like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved, they went in any of the four directions, but in a perfectly straight line. Where the cherubim went, the wheels went straight ahead. The cherubim were full of eyes in their backs, hands, and wings. The wheels likewise were full of eyes. I heard the wheels called wheels within wheels. Some people have even speculated that this cherubim machine that was described back in the day, because it makes no sense outside of that, was probably some technology that they couldn't place anywhere. And that some people say the wheels that would go in any direction in a straight line were perhaps propellers, which they couldn't explain. But this is probably not true, and they're probably overreading into ancient historical texts. But what this does tell us is that people, even then, were reaching way back in history to try and find out where is the real answer to flight. And even at this late time when airships could already fly very long distances, they realized they did not have the answer. And remember, engines had really been already invented by this time. Even a South African would try his hand at gliders, John Goodman Household and his partner in South Africa pioneered aviation in the 1800s. Born in England, he settled in Carclough, where, in addition to farming, he carried out experiments on gliders. In the 1870s, he constructed a machine with which he succeeded in taking off from the top of the Carclough. A lack of encouragement brought a sad end to his inventions. But all these inventions were merely a recovery of a previously lost art, an art that goes back to ancient China, of balloons and gliders, which were thought to be manned by human beings, and we still think they were. The problem is that back then they had no engines, they had no electrical nothing. And so crash landing is probably what you're going to get once the wind gives up on you, or once your fire gives up on you that you're using for your balloon. Now, you would think that Westerners were not aware of these, but actually, the recovery was because of these Eastern slash North African inventions. So we're going to read here by Claire Dempsey Anderson from the University of Edinburgh. The earliest source for Abbas ibn Firnas' medieval First in Flight, which was, by the way, designed 600 years before Leonardo da Vinci. As we read, until now, scholars have had to rely on accounts of the aeronautics experiments written centuries after Ibn Firnas' lifetime. The best known was by the 17th century historian al-Makari. His account was subsequently rendered in a loose English version by the 19th century Arabist Pascal de Gayangos. These later accounts have presented scholars with a rather puzzling description of the experiment. Compare these late accounts here. There is discovery of a long lost Arabic manuscript containing the earliest known medieval description of the experiment offers a clearer account of the flight composed much closer to Ibn Firnas's lifetime. This is what the manuscript reveals about the man and the experiment. Abbas ibn Firnas was so full of ingenuity, creativity, originality, and resourcefulness that he was attributed with the knowledge of magic and alchemy and was often challenged on religious grounds. Some sheikhs said that he managed to launch himself into flight. He clothed himself in feathers fastened to light-colored silk and spread for himself two wings of calculated structure with which he was able to rise in the air. He flew from the vicinity of Rusafa, moved through the air, and then circled until he landed in a place far away from where he departed. But his landing went poorly when he hurt his tailbone. He had not managed the landing very well. He did not take into account that a bird, when landing, does so on its tailhead, which he neglected. That, by the way, is a transcript written by a early Islamic scholar. And in the writings, he's not focused on just this. This happens to be something that also happened at the time, which he wrote about. The account appears in a unique Arabic manuscript copy of the Cordoban court chronicle perceived today in the Real Academia de la Historia in Madrid. Although scholars have yet to establish a secure date for the manuscript, its size, appearance, and script appear to be in keeping with other Arabic manuscripts produced in medieval North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The account was likely composed in the 10th century and compiled in the Chronicle by the celebrated historian Ibn Haywan, born 987 to 800 AD in Cordoba, making the Madrid manuscript possibly the earliest surviving historical evidence for his celebrated medieval astronautics experiment. The manuscript provides important details missing from or unclear in the later versions by Al-Makari and Pascal de Gayangos. Most significantly, the reference to two wings and to rising and movement through the air together suggest a fixed wing device and not one whose wings moved or flapped, capable, even if briefly, of what today would be described as lift and a sustained glide. In A Medieval First Flight by Blair Anderson, it says, in quoting the original people who made these flights, Al-Makari's 17th century version of the flight experiment by Ibn Firnas demonstrated ingenuity in launching his body in flight. He covered himself in feathers, provided himself with a couple of wings, and flew a considerable distance in the air. However, did not prove very ingenious in his landing. He hurt himself in the rear. He did not know that a bird lands on its tailhead, and did not make a tail for himself. And the later version, among other very curious experiments which Ibn Firnas made, one is he's trying to fly. He covered himself with feathers for the purpose, attached a couple of wings to his body, and getting on an immense, flung himself down into the air. When, according to the testimony of several trustworthy writers who witnessed the performance, he flew to a considerable distance as if he had been a bird, but in alighting again on the place whence he had started his back was very much hurt, for not knowing that birds, when they alight, came down on their tails, he forgot to provide himself with one. Later critics who were not aware of some of the older scripts that were written thought that the Ibn Firnas story was exaggerated and that he just jumped off a parachute, or maybe he had a very slight appearance of flight instead of the successful gliding that he did. And of course, the wings were something that, well, the feathers was something that was unnecessary, but it tells you how inventions are invented. Ironically, one of the people who points out this claim, false claim, that Ibn Firnas just sort of jumped off of something and landed, which is not based on any historical records, writes a book which is showing that history is necessary for invention. That invention comes from looking at the past, and then from the past, you can take some good ideas and futurize them, which is how flight came true through the Wright brothers. At least the type of flight that the Wright brothers did, because of course other people were flying before him. By contrast, Richard Halion, in Taking Flight, inventing the aerial age from antiquity through the First World War, proposed that Ibn Firnas probably did not achieve a flight, but rather a kind of medieval parachute drop using a cloak. Now, again, basing that on what? But I like the name, Taking Flight, inventing the aerial age from antiquity through the First World War. Now, of course, there's a lot of question about what Ibn Firnas was, what he looked like, and who he was. So, firstly, we have to determine that he was an African. He came from Africa, North Africa to be exact. Some scholars even describe him as a Marwa, a word which I'll use in another video, because somebody asked me, how do I know that Arabs who lived within the Islamic world were not called Arabs? Marwa is one of those words that are given to Islamic non Arabic Muslims living within the Islamic world. But I'll show that in a different video. But in this world, he is described using this word. The funny part is Ibn Firnas's glider is closer to a glider made 1,000 years later in South Africa by John Goodman Household, who was from England originally. But in description, in description, it seems like it. In description, and even John Goodman Household's glider only did, and it didn't have a tail as well, only did the type of flight that you would expect a glider to do. Now remember, he started at a high place, so there was no need for him to start off running or pushing or anything like that, which means that Ibn Firnas and John Goodman Household share that in common. And it's funny that even in the 1800s, they were only starting to experiment with that. It tells you how far the people in the Islamic Golden Age were, and that had they continued and had not fallen to both the Christians and the basically the Christian world taking over, then scholarship would have increased significantly. The golden age of Islam was not a single type invention age. It also borrowed from the ancient civilizations around them, which shows you why history is so important. The ancient civilizations it borrowed from was, of course, the ancient Greeks, ancient Africans, ancient Chinese, ancient Indians, and so much more, even the ancient Europeans, but in the form of the Greeks and the Romans. In the Greeks, we hear of an early version of flight, but what's more important is that steam power was invented in Egypt by Heron of Alexandria. I will make a whole video on how steam power was not invented in the 1700s by Europeans and was instead used in the golden age of Islam and could have been combined with those gliders in order to create more. But of course, this technology died with the inventors. But let's not go into the deepness of steam and air together, but talk about it in a slight way because, of course, I don't want to go too deep in the steam angle. But because we know there was steam power in the ancient world, we know that the Greeks had a steam powered flying system, at least written down about, using an engine, a steam engine. From NASA, we read 300 BC. Steam powered rockets, one of the first devices to successfully employ the principle essential to rocket flight, was a model pigeon made of wood and suspended from the end of a pivot bar on wires. The writings of Aulus Gallus, a Roman, tell the story of a Greek named Archytas who lived in the city of Tarentum, now a part of southern Italy. Somewhere around the year 300 BC, Archytas mystified and amused the citizens of Tarentum by flying a model pigeon, escaping steam propelled the bird, which was suspended on wires. The pigeon used the same action reaction principle as the rockets, which was not stated as a scientific law until the 17th century. Around 300 years later, another Greek hero of Alexandria invented a similar rocket like device called alopile. It too used steam power as a propulsion gas. Hero mounted a sphere on top of a water basin. A fire below the basin turned the water to steam, which traveled through pipes and into the sphere. Two L-shaped tubes on opposite sides of the sphere allowed the steam to escape and provided a thrust that caused the sphere to rotate. This, of course, being probably the earliest motor in recorded history. The prop plane or the propeller plane was utilizing all the technologies that I've named, from the glider to propellers to all of that, which, by the way, in the Islamic Golden Age, steam turbines and steam and water turbines and human turbines were known. And so there were motors that were operating back then, some of them called big wheels. But let's not focus on that. Let's talk about the jet. The jet came after the propeller plane, and it was an invention that took forever to build. And its history is actually long and weird because designers who first invented it abandoned it, thinking it wouldn't work, when it finally could have been created in some cases by, you know, people who were already in aeronautics. It was taken away and given to the government, and they did something completely different with it. If we go back, we realize that the Chinese had played a ridiculously large role in the creation of the jet. Before we read from NASA, we have to understand that, again, history plays a very important role here, because history is what gave people the idea that it was possible to build such an object. Even though Isaac Newton had come up with a cannon idea, this jet that was being used, the rockets that were being used by the Chinese, and in some cases gave people proper flight, as you will see when I read, are some of the best ideas that are not known anywhere in the world. It makes us not understand that the world we live in could have existed maybe 500, 600 years before now. And the lesson, the real lesson, which I hope everybody gets, is that it's not time that invents. You know, you always hear people say, 100 years from now, we will have this. No, it's effort. Put more effort today, and you won't have to wait until 100 years. Do you really want to die before you see what the world would look like 100 years from now? You know, you can fast forward that by putting in more effort. As you can see, some of these inventors made the mistake of not realizing how close they were to remember the divine flight that they always wanted. So, starting at the top, rockets were first used as actual weapons in the Battle of Kai Fung Fu in 1232 AD. The Chinese attempted to repel Mongol invaders with barrages of fire arrows and possibly gunpowder launch grenades. The fire arrows were a simple form of solid propellant rocket. A tube capped at one end contained gunpowder, and the other end was left open, and the tube was attached to a long stick. When the powder was ignited, the rapid burning of the powder produced fire, smoke, and gas that escaped through the open end and produced a thrust. The stick acted as a simple guidance system that kept the rocket headed in one direction. As it flew through the air, it is not clear how effective these arrows of flying fire were, but one source reported that one grenade could incinerate a 2,000 square foot area. Following the Battle of Kaikeng, the Mongols produced rockets of their own. During the 13th to the 15th century, the Mongols used rockets in their attacks on Japan and Baghdad, and may have been responsible for the spread of rockets to Europe. In England, a monk named Roger Bacon worked on an improved form of gunpowder that greatly increased the range of rockets in France. Jean Froissart found that more accurate flights could be achieved by launching rockets through tubes. Froissart's idea was a forerunner of the modern bazooka. Johannes de Fontana of Italy designed a surface running rocket powered torpedo for setting enemy ships on fire. By the 16th century, rockets fell into the time of relative disuse as a weapon of war, though they were still used extensively in firework displays. A German fireworks maker, Johann Schmidl, invented the first step rocket, a multi-staged vehicle of lifting fireworks to higher altitudes. A large rocket was ignited initially and carried one or more smaller rockets. When the large rocket burned out, the smaller rockets ignited and continued to a higher altitude before showering the sky with glowing cinders. Schl's idea, known today as staging, is basic to all modern rocketry. Nearly all uses of rockets up to this time were for warfare or fireworks, but there is an interesting old Chinese legend that reports the use of rockets as means of transportation. With the help of many assistants, a Chinese official named Wan Hu assembled a rocket powered flying chair. The chair was mounted between two wooden stakes. Attached to the chair were two large kites, and fixed to the kites were 47 fire arrow rockets. On the day of the flight, Wan Hu sat in the chair and gave the command to light the rockets. 47 assistants each arrived with torches, rushed forward to light the rockets. In a moment, there was a tremendous roar, accompanied by billowing clouds of smoke. When the smoke cleared, Wan Hu and his flying chair were gone. No one knows for sure what happened to Wan Hu, but it is probable that the event really did take place. Fire arrows still as apt to explode as to fly. The story of Wan Hu is one that I heard when I was a little kid, and I remember laughing at the idea of someone doing this and thinking, oh, he probably blew himself up and died. And I thought, how stupid are people from the ancient world? But then when you reread the story and you figure out, like, oh, that's what really happened. Now, this drawing is a terrible design of what it was probably like. It was probably way bigger with way bigger wings. And of course, like you said, there was big giant smoke, and he probably did fly. The chances of him flying are very high considering that he used almost all the best tools of the day to fly. This would be probably the longest form of flight. Now, he was never heard of again, so he probably died, or landed wrong, or maybe, went insane. Who knows what happened? But he was never seen again. His body and the vehicle he was riding was not in that same spot, meaning it had gone from the original location. It took flight. It didn't just explode in his face, as so many misfirings in history have happened. Though one whose flight is probably one of the earliest recorded in Chinese history, it is not the earliest, because earlier than that we find around 400 BC, this is from NASA, the discovery of the kite that could fly in the air by the Chinese started humans thinking about flying. Kites were used by the Chinese in religious ceremonies. They built many colorful kites for fun. Also, more sophisticated kites were used to test weather conditions. Kites have been important to the invention of flight as they were the forerunner to balloons and gliders. Now you would think the Wright brothers invent the glider, which is a fusion of many inventions, the engine, there's a lot of things within this which are not even visible, like cranks and stuff, that were invented before, and they were put together. And everybody has probably heard that, their mother, who died very early, was one of the inspirations for them getting into this in the first place. But you would think that, okay, so they built this and then they built the next version of the airplane and the next version and the next version. But once it became popular that this was the direction that airplanes were going to take, several other people started designing their own type and even patenting them, some of them being sued by the Wright brothers. The airplane led to a series of pilots never seen before. People were envious. People couldn't believe it. Only a few people could get their hands on these. The poor people could only get their hands on it after they had studied for years in order to become pilots. But there was one thing that drove people away from wanting to be a pilot, and that's crashes. And there were many of them. The early pioneers or the early pilots died, a lot of them, and was only after years and years of research changing the shape of wings, which, by the way, had they gone and looked back in history, they would have discovered that you can't just make square things in the air. Air needs to glide, and all kinds of things that were discovered in Chinese, Islamic, Greek, and so on history about propulsion and all this type of stuff. If they had looked back, they would have saved a lot of lives. But it took time, and eventually we got to where we are today. There's actually a video online, I hope I link it, of Haile Selassie flying a plane in the 1930s. Because, of course, you hear about this, and he had the wealth back then. So, why not? Why not give it a shot? Of course, airplanes were toys for the rich, and Haile Selassie, being rich and being in charge, decided to give it a go. Fortunately for him, he didn't end up like some of the early pilots who basically crashed. The some of the Europeans who had sort of enabled him to do this had this crash landed and he perished, it might have sent things spiraling in a different direction. Luckily, Ethiopia started training its own pilots in the name of people like Mule Mehbet Emeru, who was the first female pilot of Africa. And of course, there was a black pilot in Turkey and all of that. So there's a lot of firsts, and not everybody who did this perished. Ahmed Ali surname was a Nigerian descendant, but Turkish in raising, and this Turkish black man is considered to be the first black pilot in history. In 1914, he flew to France from Turkey. With many other Turks, he participated in flight in World War One, which again is very interesting for him, his life trajectory. Of course, Africa would play a lot of roles from that date on, both in invention and in continuation of airplanes. If we dip back into history, we can see that Leonardo da Vinci was one of the earliest to design some flying airplanes and helicopters. Now, I will say the curiosity about the helicopter and why it's shaped the way it is very similar to a lot of designs I've seen from ancient China about how they designed toy helicopters, and the wings that he designs, it does to some degree remind me of some of the Islamic drawings. But I'm not saying that he got them from there. He probably did. But he is famous, and so there's no need to deep dive into him. In ancient China, there was a toy called the bamboo copter. It was not called that in Chinese, but kids used to play with it. They would take it and spin it and all of that. And then the more sophisticated one had rope that you could pull, and it would fly up into the air fairly high. This is probably the oldest version of this type of flight that was recorded outside of obviously nature, which people saw. They saw leaves falling in a spiral like pattern and realized that there was something to that. Now, were there drops earlier than these dates where people would take clothing and jump from a high place? Absolutely. Were there, are there times when people flew in other ways that we do not have today? Yes. But these are the ones that are documented, and they are in no way the full history of flight.